Atris was once considered one of the Jedi Order's brightest and most promising members, a woman whose intellect, discipline, and commitment to the Jedi teachings marked her as a figure of reverence and respect. Her rise through the ranks of the Jedi was a testament to her strength and devotion to the ideals of the Order, which she believed to be the foundation of peace and justice in the galaxy. However, her story is also one of tragic fall, obsession, and eventual isolation, characterized by a powerful internal conflict that led her to mistreat those closest to her. The tale of Atris is not just about her devotion to the Jedi, but also about the darker aspects of her character and the toll that her personal beliefs and obsessions took on those around her. Born on the planet Coruscant, Atris was raised in the heart of the Jedi Order. From an early age, she exhibited a keen mind and a deep understanding of the Jedi Code. Her natural aptitude for learning made her one of the Order's brightest young scholars, and she quickly gained recognition among the Jedi Council. As she matured, Atris became known not only for her intelligence but also for her strong sense of duty and commitment to the Jedi Code. She was determined to uphold the teachings of the Jedi, to protect the Republic from the forces of darkness, and to maintain the purity of the Order's values. Her rise through the ranks was steady, and she soon earned a place on the Jedi Council. However, her role as a scholar and diplomat was not enough for Atris. She believed herself to be one of the few who truly understood the gravity of the Jedi's mission. Her sense of duty drove her to push herself beyond the expectations of her peers. This drive, however, soon gave birth to a deep sense of superiority over those she deemed less disciplined or capable. She became increasingly frustrated with the perceived complacency and failure of some of her fellow Jedi, especially those who did not share her absolute commitment to the Jedi way. Her dissent began during the events of the Mandalorian Wars, a conflict that saw the Jedi divided over whether or not to intervene in the war. Atris, like many on the Jedi Council, was deeply opposed to the Jedi's involvement in the conflict, seeing it as a violation of the Jedi Code. She was part of the faction that advocated for non-intervention, firmly believing that the Jedi were above the political struggles of the galaxy. When the Jedi Exile, whose real name was Mitra Surik, defied the Council's wishes and led a group of Jedi into battle, Atris's opinion of her turned cold. To Atris, the Exile's actions were not just a betrayal of the Jedi Code, but a profound insult to everything she held dear. The Exile's willingness to fight and lead in battle clashed with Atris's rigid interpretation of the Jedi philosophy, and this disagreement would become the root of Atris's obsession. The fall of Atris was further accelerated by her increasing detachment from her fellow Jedi and her growing obsession with the Jedi Exile. After the conclusion of the Mandalorian Wars, Atris became consumed with the idea that the Exile had turned her back on the Jedi Order and betrayed its principles. She viewed the Exile's actions as an unforgivable breach of the Jedi Code, a mistake that threatened the very foundation of the Order. This obsession with the Exile's supposed betrayal would dominate Atris's thoughts for years to come, leading her down a path of isolation, bitterness, and eventual corruption. Atris's fall was not simply a result of her disillusionment with the Jedi Exile, but also the result of her own internal struggles. While outwardly appearing to uphold the Jedi Code and its principles, Atris's mind became increasingly clouded by emotions that she had long suppressed: anger, jealousy, and fear. These feelings began to manifest in her treatment of others, particularly the handmaiden, Brianna. Brianna was one of the few individuals who truly saw Atris's inner turmoil, and her presence served as a painful reminder of everything Atris had lost and failed to control. Brianna, who had been a loyal servant to Atris, became an unwitting victim of Atris's obsession with the Exile. Atris's mistreatment of Brianna was a tragic manifestation of her growing instability. Brianna was a former handmaiden to the Sith Lord, Darth Revan, and had defected to the Jedi side. She found a new sense of purpose in the Jedi Order, particularly under Atris's tutelage. However, Atris, obsessed with her belief that the Exile had betrayed the Jedi Order, viewed Brianna's connection to the Exile as a threat. Atris's jealousy and resentment toward Brianna's loyalty to the Exile led her to push Brianna away, treating her with disdain and cruelty. The once kind mentor became a bitter, judgmental figure, focusing all her anger and frustration on the handmaiden, whose only fault was her association with the very person Atris had come to despise. This mistreatment of Brianna was a tragic symptom of Atris's deeper issues. Her growing obsession with the Exile, and her inability to reconcile the Exile's actions with her own rigid interpretation of the Jedi Code, led Atris to lash out at those who reminded her of her own failure. Brianna, caught in the crossfire of Atris's internal conflict, suffered as a result of her mentor's emotional instability. The relationship between the two became one of tension and hostility, with Atris blaming Brianna for everything she saw as wrong with the Jedi Order. The more Atris mistreated Brianna, the more she seemed to push the young woman toward her own fall, exacerbating the cycle of bitterness and disillusionment. Atris's obsession with the Exile, combined with her mistreatment of Brianna, further isolated her from the rest of the Jedi Order. She withdrew into her private chambers, surrounding herself with the records of the Jedi and the teachings of the old Jedi Masters. She believed that the Jedi Order had lost its way, and that she alone understood the true path to preserving the Jedi Code. As a result, Atris's fall was complete. She no longer trusted her fellow Jedi, and she became increasingly consumed by her own bitter thoughts, convinced that the Exile's actions had set the galaxy on a course toward destruction. Atris's downfall culminated in her eventual betrayal of the Jedi Order. As the Jedi Exile returned to the galaxy, Atris, unable to let go of her hatred, turned against her. She sought to undermine the Exile's efforts, believing that the Exile's presence posed a threat to the Jedi's survival. Her obsession with the Exile reached its peak, and she became a shadow of the woman she once was. A cold, calculating figure who was willing to sacrifice everything in order to preserve her vision of the Jedi Order. By the time the Exile confronted Atris, the once proud Jedi Master had become a broken shell of her former self. The Exile's return forced Atris to confront the consequences of her actions. She realized too late that her obsession had consumed her, turning her against the very principles she had once sworn to uphold. In the end, Atris's story is one of tragic self-destruction. Her rise, her fall, and her obsessive pursuit of the Jedi Exile leading her to alienate those who cared for her and to betray everything she had once believed in. In conclusion, Atris's life is a stark reminder of the dangers of obsession, pride, and rigidity. Her rise to power was marked by her intelligence and discipline, but her downfall was the result of her inability to adapt and her refusal to accept the complexities of the galaxy. Her mistreatment of Brianna, as well as her obsession with the Jedi Exile, is a tragic reflection of her internal struggle, and ultimately, it led to her isolation and betrayal of the Jedi Order. Atris's story is one of self-destruction, a tale of how one's inability to let go of the past and to accept the flaws of both oneself and others can lead to ruin. Atris's rise within the Jedi Order was marked by a combination of intellectual prowess, strict adherence to the Jedi Code, and a deep sense of duty. Born and raised on Coruscant, she quickly distinguished herself as an insightful and disciplined student. As a young Jedi, she was renowned for her analytical mind, and she rose quickly through the ranks to become one of the most respected figures within the Order. Her ability to process complex situations, combined with her dedication to the ideals of the Jedi, led her to be seen as a model Jedi. However, beneath her disciplined exterior, a simmering sense of superiority and inflexibility began to take root, shaping her future actions. While many Jedi were content to follow the Council's guidance without questioning it, Atris was different. She was not content with merely being a servant to the Republic or a figurehead in the Jedi hierarchy. She sought a deeper understanding of the Jedi Order's teachings and believed herself to be one of the few Jedi capable of truly comprehending its depths. This intellectual ambition, while impressive, would eventually transform into a dangerous obsession with what she saw as the preservation of the Jedi way. Her views on the Jedi Order became more rigid as time went on. She began to see herself not merely as a member of the Jedi Council, but as its moral and intellectual superior. Atris saw the other Jedi as flawed and often short-sighted, especially during the turbulent period of the Mandalorian Wars. While many Jedi were eager to fight for the Republic, Atris took a hardline stance against the war, believing that involvement would violate the Jedi Code. To her, the role of the Jedi was to remain neutral above the conflicts of the galaxy. When the Jedi Exile, Mitra led a group of Jedi into battle against the Mandalorians, Atris was appalled. She viewed the Exile's actions as not only a betrayal of the Jedi Code, but a profound mistake that would leave a stain on the entire Order. It was this deepening belief in her own understanding of the Jedi path that began to isolate Atris from her peers. She became increasingly critical of those around her, especially those who did not share her unwavering commitment to the Jedi teachings. The Exile's decision to defy the Jedi Council was seen by Atris as an unforgivable act of disobedience. The Exile's leadership in the war was a symbol of everything Atris had come to despise: a deviation from the Jedi Code, a fall into the chaos of the galaxy. The more she dwelled on the Exile's actions, the more Atris became obsessed with the idea that the Exile was a threat to the very existence of the Jedi Order. Her obsession with the Exile grew more intense after the war ended, particularly when the Exile chose to leave the Order rather than return to the Council's fold. Atris, already bitter and angry, saw this as a confirmation of her fears, that the Exile's influence would lead others down a dark path. In her mind, the Exile had not only abandoned the Jedi but had also fundamentally misunderstood the role of the Jedi in the galaxy. Atris's fear of the Exile's potential to corrupt others only fueled her desire to see the Exile punished or, at the very least, removed from the galaxy's future. This obsession with the Exile not only consumed Atris intellectually but began to warp her emotions and actions as well. Her once clear moral compass became distorted by anger and resentment. She believed that the Exile had disgraced the Order, and her need to protect the Jedi's ideals led her to view any action as justified if it helped prevent the Exile from returning to the Order. In the process, Atris lost sight of the very compassion and humility that the Jedi Order was meant to instill in its members. As Atris's obsession with the Exile deepened, it also began to manifest in her mistreatment of others, most notably Brianna, the handmaiden. Brianna, a former servant of Darth Revan who had defected to the Jedi Order, became one of Atris's most trusted students. Despite Brianna's own troubled past, she found solace and purpose in the Jedi Order and in Atris's mentorship. However, as Atris's obsession with the Exile grew, her treatment of Brianna began to change. Brianna, who had once admired Atris, found herself the target of the Jedi Master's scorn and harsh judgment. At first, Atris's treatment of Brianna was subtle, a quiet but palpable shift in how she regarded the young woman. Brianna, who had once been a loyal servant to Atris, found herself caught between her admiration for her mentor and the increasing cruelty she received from her. Atris's obsession with the Exile made her increasingly hostile to anyone who had any connection to the Exile, and Brianna, as a former handmaiden to Revan, was seen as a symbol of everything Atris despised. Brianna had been close to the Exile's former master, and as such she was, in Atris's eyes, tainted by that connection. Rather than showing empathy for Brianna's struggle to find her place within the Jedi Order, Atris grew resentful of her, viewing her as a constant reminder of her own failures. Brianna's loyalty to the Exile, though indirect, became a source of tension between the two. Atris's bitterness, born of her own insecurities and her overwhelming obsession with the Exile, led her to push Brianna away. Instead of nurturing Brianna's growth as a Jedi, Atris punished her for the mere association with the Exile, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and disdain. Brianna, for her part, could not understand the growing hostility. She had come to Atris for guidance, hoping to prove herself as a capable Jedi, but instead found herself belittled and manipulated. She had once trusted Atris, seeing her as a mentor and role model, but as the Jedi Master's obsession with the Exile grew, Brianna was left to navigate a relationship that was increasingly toxic and one-sided. Brianna's own sense of loyalty to the Exile and her desire to find peace with her own past made her an easy target for Atris's cruelty. In the process, Brianna became one of the casualties of Atris's internal turmoil. Atris's obsession with the Exile not only blinded her to Brianna's needs, but also undermined the trust and bond that had once existed between them. Brianna, instead of finding guidance and understanding, was subjected to the cold, harsh judgment of her mentor, who saw only the exile's betrayal and her own wounded pride. The once strong connection between the two women became a fractured, painful one, as Atris's obsession drove her further away from the very ideals she had once embodied. As the events of the galaxy unfolded, Atris's obsession with the exile became her undoing. She began to lose touch with the Jedi's true purpose, and her inability to reconcile with her past led her into isolation. Her relationships with her fellow Jedi, once strong, deteriorated as she became more and more consumed by her obsession. She withdrew from the Council, focusing entirely on her personal mission to protect the Jedi Order from the exile's influence. But in doing so, she betrayed the very essence of what the Jedi Order stood for. In the end, Atris's story is one of tragic self-destruction. Her rise as a scholar and Jedi Master was eclipsed by her inability to let go of the past and her obsessive drive to protect the Jedi Order from the exile's perceived threat. Her mistreatment of Brianna, once a loyal student, was the ultimate consequence of her obsession, a reflection of how far she had fallen from the Jedi ideals she had once espoused. Atris's failure to recognize her own flaws and her inability to forgive the exile ultimately led her to a bitter, lonely end, a shadow of the Jedi she had once been.